Imagine living in a world where you can only go as far as a horse can carry you in a day, where visiting a friend 20 miles away requires planning, expense, and most of a day's travel, where the smell of manure is everywhere and cities are drowning in horse waste. That was life in 1890. Just 30 years later, everything had changed. The horse had been replaced by the automobile. Personal car ownership went from essentially zero to millions. The car transformed how we lived, where we lived, what our cities looked like, and how we thought about freedom and independence. But here's the thing, the car wasn't inevitable. It wasn't even obvious that it would succeed. For decades, people tried and failed to make personal vehicles work, and when the car finally did take off, it wasn't because of technology. It was because of business strategy, mass production, and one man who understood that the path to riches wasn't selling expensive cars to rich people. This is the story of why personal cars became a thing. It's about the collision of invention, capitalism, and American culture. And it reveals something profound about how transformative technologies actually spread. The answer is never just because it was a good idea. Let's start with the problem the car was supposed to solve: the horse. In the late 1800s, horses were everywhere. They were the primary mode of transportation in cities and the countryside. New York City alone had over 150,000 horses. Every business that needed to move goods used horses. Every person who needed to travel used horses. And horses created an unimaginable amount of problems. First, the waste. A single horse produces 15 to 30 pounds of manure per day. In New York, that meant over 3 million pounds of horse manure on the streets every single day, plus tens of thousands of gallons of urine. Streets were covered in it. The smell was overwhelming. In summer it dried and turned to dust that filled the air and people's lungs. In rain it became a thick, toxic sludge. Then there were the dead horses. Horses don't live long under the strain of city work. When they died, they often died in the street, and removing a 1,000-pound dead animal was difficult and expensive. Sometimes they'd just be left to rot until they'd decomposed enough to be easily removed. One estimate suggested that New York City had to dispose of 15,000 dead horses per year. Beyond the sanitary nightmare, horses were expensive. You had to buy them, feed them, stable them, and care for them when they got sick or injured. For businesses, this was a massive ongoing cost. For individuals, owning a horse was a luxury most couldn't afford. Horses also limited mobility. They could only go so fast and so far before needing rest. You couldn't reliably travel more than 20 or 30 miles in a day. By the 1890s, urban planners were genuinely worried. Cities were growing rapidly, which meant more horses, which meant more waste. Some predicted that cities would soon be buried under horse manure. They called it the Great Horse Manure Crisis. The car seemed like the obvious solution. No waste, faster, more reliable. But making a practical car proved incredibly difficult. The first self-propelled vehicles date back centuries. Steam-powered vehicles existed in the 1700s, but they were massive, slow, dangerous, and impractical for personal use. In the 1860s and 70s, inventors across Europe and America experimented with various designs. Some used steam, some used electricity. Some tried early internal combustion engines powered by gas. Carl Benz is generally credited with creating the first practical automobile powered by an internal combustion engine in 1885 in Germany. It was a three-wheeled vehicle that could reach about 10 miles per hour. It was revolutionary. It was also completely unaffordable for average people. This is the critical point. Early cars were toys for the wealthy. They were expensive, unreliable, difficult to operate, and there was no infrastructure to support them. No gas stations, no mechanics, no paved roads. In America in 1900, there were only about 8,000 cars in the entire country. They were playthings for millionaires. Hobbyist vehicles, status symbols. The idea that every family would own a car seemed absurd. Why would you? Horses worked fine. Trains existed for long distances. Electric streetcars were being built in cities. The car was an interesting novelty, but not a necessity. Then Henry Ford changed everything. Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile. He didn't even invent the assembly line. What Ford understood was something more profound. The path to dominating a market isn't selling expensive products to a few people, It's selling cheap products to everyone. Ford's vision was radical for his time. He wanted to build a car so affordable that his own factory workers could buy one. A car for the masses, not the classes. In 1908, Ford introduced the Model T. The Model T wasn't the best car. It wasn't the fastest or most comfortable or most sophisticated. But it was simple, reliable, and most importantly, cheap. The first Model T sold for $850. That's still expensive for 1908, but it was less than half the price of most other cars, and Ford's entire strategy was to keep driving the price down. How? Mass production. Before Ford, cars were built by skilled craftsmen. Each car was essentially custom-made. Workers would gather parts and assemble a car from start to finish in one location. It was slow and expensive. Ford revolutionized this with the moving assembly line. The idea was simple but transformative. Instead of workers moving to the car moves to the workers. Each worker performs one specific task. As the car moves past them on a conveyor, install this part. Tighten these bolts, move to the next car. Ford didn't invent this concept, but he perfected it for automobile production. In 1913, he opened the Highland Park plant with a full moving assembly line. The results were staggering. Before the assembly line, it took about 12 hours to build a Model T. After the assembly line, it took 93 minutes. Let that sink in. Ford had reduced production time by over 90%. This meant Ford could produce more cars, faster, and with fewer workers. As production increased, costs dropped. As costs dropped, Ford lowered the price. By 1916, a Model T cost just $360. By the early 20s, it was under $300. This is how you create a mass market. You don't wait for people to get rich enough to afford your product. You make your product cheap enough that people can afford it. But Ford made another brilliant move that's often overlooked. He paid his workers well. In 1914, Ford announced he would pay his factory workers $5 a day. This was roughly double what other manufacturers paid. People thought he was insane. Why would you pay workers more than you have to? Ford's logic was perfect. If you pay workers well, they can afford to buy your product. His own employees became his customers. Higher wages also reduced turnover and attracted better workers, which improved productivity. It was a virtuous cycle. Better pay, better workers, better productivity, lower costs, lower prices, more customers, more revenue, higher pay. By the early 1920s, Ford was selling over 1 million Model Ts per year. The car had gone from luxury item to common household object in less than 2 decades. But Ford's success created a new problem: competition. General Motors, founded by William Durant, saw what Ford was doing and took a different approach. Instead of selling one basic car to everyone, GM would sell different cars to different customers. Alfred Sloan, who became president of GM in 1923, perfected this strategy. GM created multiple brands targeting different market segments. Chevrolet for entry-level buyers, Pontiac for those wanting something nicer, Oldsmobile and Buick for middle-class success, Cadillac for the wealthy. Sloan called it a car for every person purpose. But the real genius was the upgrade path. You'd buy a Chevrolet when you were young and starting out. As you made more money, you'd trade it in for a Pontiac, then an Oldsmobile, then a Buick. Wealthy people bought Cadillacs. GM also introduced the annual model year. Every year, new models with slight improvements and style changes. This created planned obsolescence. Your car still worked, but it looked outdated. Social pressure encouraged you to upgrade. Ford, meanwhile, stuck with the Model T. It came in one color, black, and Ford saw no reason to change a winning formula. He famously said customers could have any color they wanted, as long as it was black. This stubbornness nearly destroyed Ford Motor Company. By the late 1920s, GM had overtaken Ford in sales. People wanted choice, they wanted style, they wanted the new model. Ford eventually had to discontinue the Model T in 1927 and introduce the Model A. But GM had already won the strategic battle. Here's the broader point. The car succeeded not just because it was better than horses, but because business strategy made it accessible and desirable. Mass production made it affordable. High wages created customers. Marketing created desire. Financing options made it possible for people to buy cars they couldn't afford outright. But there's another critical factor in why cars became universal: infrastructure. The early cars ran on terrible roads. Most roads were unpaved dirt paths designed for horses, not vehicles. In rain, they became impassable. Long-distance travel was an adventure fraught with breakdowns and getting stuck. The car industry, along with car enthusiasts, lobbied aggressively for better roads. They argued that good roads were essential for commerce and national defense. In 1916, the Federal Aid Road Act provided federal money for state highway construction. The 1920s saw massive road-building programs across America. As roads improved, cars became more practical. As cars became more practical, more people bought them. As more people bought them, there was more pressure for better roads. Another infrastructure element: gas stations. In the early days, you bought gasoline at general stores in cans. It was inconvenient and limited how far you could travel. The first purpose-built gas station opened in 1905. By the 1920s, gas stations were everywhere, making car travel far more convenient. Mechanics and repair shops proliferated. Parts became standardized and widely available. A whole ecosystem developed around the automobile. This is how transformative technologies actually spread. It's not just the invention itself, it's the ecosystem that develops around it. The infrastructure, the business models, the cultural acceptance. But perhaps the most important factor in the car's success was cultural. The car represented freedom. In America especially, the car became synonymous with independence and individuality. You could go wherever you wanted, whenever you wanted, without relying on train schedules or streetcar routes. Young people could escape parental supervision. Families could take road trips. The car enabled suburban living, letting people work in cities while living in quieter, more spacious areas. The car transformed courtship, leisure, and social life. It changed where people shopped, creating suburban shopping centers. It changed how cities were designed, leading to urban sprawl. This cultural transformation fed back into demand. The car wasn't just transportation. It was a statement about who you were and how you lived. By 1930, there were over 23 million cars registered in the United States. By 1950, it was over 40 million today. It's over 280 million. The car had gone from non-existent to absolutely essential in about 50 years. So why did personal cars become a thing? It wasn't just because they were better than horses, though they were. It wasn't just because of technology, though innovations in engines and manufacturing mattered. Cars became universal because of a confluence of factors. Mass production made them affordable. High wages created customers who could buy them. Clever marketing created desire. Financing made immediate purchase possible. Infrastructure development made them practical. And cultural values made them desirable beyond their practical utility. Henry Ford often gets credit as the man who put America on wheels. That's partially true, but it's more accurate to say Ford understood that creating a mass market required more than just building a good product. You had to build it cheaply, pay workers enough to buy it, and create a system that made ownership practical and desirable. The lesson applies far beyond cars. Every transformative technology follows similar patterns. Personal computers didn't take off until they became affordable, and software made them useful for regular people. Smartphones didn't become universal until they were cheap enough, and cellular networks were good enough. Electric cars today are following the exact same trajectory. Early electric cars were expensive toys for wealthy enthusiasts. Tesla's strategy has been classic Henry Ford. Build expensive cars first to fund development, then progressively make cheaper models to reach mass market. As battery costs drop, charging infrastructure expands, and prices come down, electric cars will likely follow the same adoption curve that gas cars did a century ago. The technology alone isn't enough. You need the business strategy, the infrastructure, the cultural acceptance, and most importantly, you need to make it accessible to regular people. That's what Henry Ford understood in 1908. That's why personal cars became a thing. Not because they were invented, but because they were made available. Before the car, most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. Your world was limited by how far you could walk, or a horse could carry you. The car expanded human possibility. It made distance irrelevant. It enabled mobility that previous generations couldn't imagine. But it also changed society in ways that weren't all positive. Cars enabled suburban sprawl, which contributed to the decline of city centers. They increased pollution. They made us more isolated, spending hours alone in metal boxes instead of interacting with neighbors. The interstate highway system, built in the 1950s, often deliberately destroyed neighborhoods through eminent domain. Cars reshaped cities in ways that prioritized vehicle movement over human community. Car-centric development made walking and public transit less viable, which disproportionately affected people who couldn't afford cars. It created traffic, parking problems, and contributed to climate change. None of this was inevitable. It was the result of choices about how to design cities and allocate resources. The car didn't have to dominate American life the way it does in many countries. They managed to balance cars with robust public transit and walkable cities. But in America, the car became culturally dominant. Not just a tool, but a symbol of freedom that was almost sacred. That cultural power made it almost impossible to question car-centric development. Suggesting that maybe we'd built too many roads or should invest more in trains was seen as un-American. We're still living with those decisions. American cities are designed for cars, not people. Most places you literally can't survive without a car. Public transit is underfunded and stigmatized. Walking or biking is often dangerous or impossible. The car's success created a kind of lock-in. Once society reorganized around cars, it became extremely difficult to change course. This is another lesson about transformative technologies. They don't just add to existing society, they reshape society in their image. And once that reshaping happens, it's very hard to undo. The car went from zero to ubiquitous in about 50 years. It took less than 2 generations to completely restructure American life around the assumption that everyone has a car. We're potentially at a similar inflection point now. Self-driving cars, if they work, could be as transformative as the original car. Electric cars are already reshaping the auto industry. Ride-sharing has changed how young people think about car ownership. But here's the thing. Technology alone won't determine what comes next. Just like with the Model T, what matters is the business strategy, the infrastructure investment, the cultural values, and most importantly, who has the power to shape how these technologies get deployed. If we've learned anything from the history of personal cars, it's that transformative technologies don't just happen. They're made to happen by people with vision, capital, and often a willingness to reshape society to fit their product. Henry Ford didn't just build cars, he built a world where cars were necessary. That's the real story of why personal cars became a thing. Not because they were invented, but because someone figured out how to make them essential. And once something becomes essential, it's almost impossible to imagine life without it. Try to picture your life without a car. For most Americans, it's nearly unthinkable. Your job, your home, your social life, everything is structured around car ownership. That's not natural or inevitable. It's the result of 100 years of business decisions, infrastructure choices, and cultural evolution. The car won. Completely and totally. The world before the car and the world after the car are fundamentally different places. And it all started with one simple idea. What if we made it cheap enough that everyone could have one?